by the candidates, and the order of the debate in terms of receiving questions as well as the order of opening and closing statements were determined by coin toss. Our panelists will be directing questions specifically to each candidate. The responding candidate will have 90 seconds to respond, and their counterpart will have 45 seconds for rebuttal. Please keep in mind that the moderator has the discretion to allow for an additional 30-second rebuttal when warranted. Also, our panelists may do a follow-up question for if they believe that a question has not been answered, and the candidate will have up to 30 seconds to respond to it again. I will also be asking questions that have been submitted to me by each candidate to be asked of their opponent. The candidates will have 90 seconds to respond to their opponent's question. There will be no rebuttals for this portion of the debate. We will be strictly adhering to the allotted times. Candidates will see a yellow light when they have 15 seconds remaining. The red light will appear when time is up. So I know you all can't see that, but there's a little light box down there. Now, the rules for all of you in the audience. Please pay close attention to these rules because they will be closely adhered to. Other than the approved event photographer and credentialed media, there will be no videotaping allowed by any attendees, and no photography is allowed. Please limit your applause to the closing remarks. No applause is allowed during the question rounds, since it will make it more difficult to end the program on schedule and also difficult for others in the audience to hear the responses. Out of respect to the candidates and to your fellow attendees, there will be no yelling out allowed during the course of this debate. We do have security in the auditorium, and any members of the audience disrupting the debate will be escorted out. But I am certain we will have no issues with this group here tonight, and the entire audience will enjoy a very informative exchange from our candidates. Okay, let's introduce our media panel. We have panelists with us this evening that cover Palm Beach County and the Treasure Coast. From the Palm Beach Post, we have George Bennett. From CBS, Janet Eschbach. From WPTV News Channel 5, John Shaman. And from TC Palm, Isadora Rangel. It's time now to bring our candidates to the stage. Let's welcome Mr. Carl Domino and Mr. Patrick Murphy. I would like to remind the audience to please hold your applause until the conclusion of the debate. So we begin with Patrick Murphy. You have 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth, for putting this together, and thank you for your leadership at the Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for the panel, for being here. Thank you to the audience, of course, for your support, and thank you to Mr. Domino for being here this evening and your military service to our country. I was elected to Congress on a message of bipartisanship and getting things done for our district. And I stand by that pledge, by working to get our fiscal house in order, fighting for our local communities, and being an independent voice in Washington. I believe I've been a strong advocate for the Palm Beaches and Treasure Coast. First, by working with Republicans and Democrats, I introduced the SAVE Act, a bill that identified $330 billion of wasteful, duplicative government spending. It ended up getting 7 amendments passed, cutting tens of billions of dollars of wasteful government spending. I supported legislation to force the president to have a balanced budget. And I'm one of 6 Democrats in the country to be endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I supported legislation, bipartisan, to reduce the burdensome regulations on businesses. But the work I'm most proud of is right here at home. First, by securing $12 million for beach renourishment and inlet dredging. Another $38 million for C-44, a project that will help clean and treat that dirty water out of Lake Okeechobee. And I've been working diligently with local, state, and federal representatives, fighting against all aboard Florida, making sure it isn't a detriment to our communities, to the safety of our communities, to the quality of our life, or a waste of taxpayer dollars. And I've been working tirelessly since the day I was elected to bridge the divide between the 2 parties. I was recently ranked to be in the top 5% most independent voter in all of Congress, and I've consistently rejected congressional perks, rejecting pay raises, rejecting health care subsidies, and rejecting a paycheck if Congress doesn't pass a budget. I look forward to a positive exchange of ideas this evening, and again, thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Domino.
Well, thank you for attending this important debate, and thank you, Congressman Murphy. Congressman Murphy has done a lot of ads about being independent. He is, in fact, a Democrat. And he's a Democrat that has supported Obamacare. Obamacare is costing our citizens in our district every day more money for their insurance, and they are not getting the doctors or the policies they were promised. Even the CBO says that Obamacare will cost our economy 2.5 million jobs. Congressman Murphy has supported the president's pathway to citizenship, the DREAM Act. He supports amnesty for illegal immigrants. Those immigrants are costing the citizens of Florida billions of dollars and taking jobs. Just a few weeks ago, when the Republicans had a bill to enhance border security, Congressman Murphy rejected that bill. 2 years ago, when he ran, Congressman Murphy called for a prompt and complete withdrawal of our soldiers from Iraq. And every day we see on TV the consequences of that judgment, one which even Leon Panetta has questioned. As ISIL takes over cities in Iraq and in Syria, and literally beheads people because they are either Christian or Jewish. A few months ago, Congressman Murphy went to Afghanistan. He came back, and he said that the Afghan government, the troops, were holding the Taliban at bay. But just last week in the New York Times, it turns out in Afghanistan, the Taliban is killing both military and civilian targets and has more strength than they've had in the last several years. In his domestic office, he is paying his female employees 61% of his male employees. And most important to our citizens, this time last year, he was advocating the building of all aboard Florida. He took campaign contributions and wrote a letter to the Department of Transportation asking them to expedite that project.
All right, we're going to begin with our round of questions. George Bennett will ask the first question of Mr. Domino.
Sure, Mr. Domino. One of the things you mentioned prominently in your remarks and throughout your campaign has been your opposition to Obamacare. You've been less clear, at least from what I've heard, as far as what you would support in its place. What, if you were elected to Congress, would you support repealing it, and what legislation would you support to replace it?
Thank you for the question. If I were elected to Congress, I would vote for repeal and reform of Obamacare. But I'm realistic enough to understand as long as the Senate is controlled by the Democratic Party, and as long as Barack Obama is in the White House, he will not admit his mistake. His mistake is costing thousands of people their insurance. We need an approach to health care that takes the best things that were in there. Elimination of the lifetime limits, the ability for pre-existing condition people to get coverage. But we really need an approach that instead of just redistributing income, because that's all Obamacare did, it said, well, you're going to health care and someone else is going to pay for it. We need to look at two fundamentals of health care. One is that in most European countries, we spend about 8 to 10% of national activity on health care. In America, it's 18%. Tort reform and less defensive medicine can lower that number. Secondly, in America, we spend on 5% of people 50% of the health care. We need to go out to experts in the fields of disease management, to doctors, people who know how to run hospitals, and understand how we can make both of those numbers lower so that health care can be accessible and affordable to every citizen.
Go ahead, Mr. Murphy, you're about.
Based on that opening statement of my opponent, that is exactly what's wrong with Washington, D.C., that sort of partisanship and finger pointing and no solutions. You see, there's two very clear groups of people in Washington, D.C., especially as it relates to things like the Affordable Care Act. You have one group of people saying, no, we must repeal it, it's completely broken, and that is previously what my opponent said. And then you have a group saying, no, it's perfect, don't touch it. The truth is, it's probably somewhere in the middle. And neither of those two groups are realistic or accurate. It's somewhere in the middle. And I've supported 18 different pieces of legislation that I believe would improve the Affordable Care Act. Things like, if you like your plan, you can keep it. Repealing the medical device tax. Delay of the mandate. So I continue to be a problem solver regardless of the issue.
Okay, the next question will be asked by Jana Eschbach of Mr. Murphy.
Representative Murphy, one of the accusations by your opponent in the opening statement was that you pay your female staff less than your male staff. In the research that we've done in recent weeks, we found that to be, the pay amounts to be equal. Is that, or is that true, untrue? Do you pay your female staff less?
Well, thank you for bringing that up. I'm actually surprised my opponent mentioned it. The TC Palm actually refuted that statement. It is inaccurate. I pay my employees, male and female, the exact same amount for doing equal work. And the part that actually surprises me is I supported legislation that said across the board, across our country, men and women should get paid the exact same amount. My opponent actually said he doesn't support that legislation nationally, so I'm surprised he even brought it up. It's a nonsense claim. I pay everyone in my office the same exact amount for doing the same exact amount of work.
Mr. Domino.
There's a nuance here because the number came from Mr. Bennett. He says he pays everyone for doing the same work, and he cites his chief of staff email, they each 112. But the fact is, the other high-paying jobs, he must give only to men, because he only pays them 61%. And the bill he said he sponsored equal pay, when he and Lois Franklin stood on the stage together to support that Democratic bill, they mentioned the number 77%. And that's what females in the American economy, regardless of what job they were doing, were getting paid. So he bases his political agenda on a number that doesn't look at job-by-job comparisons, but he wants to hide by a job-by-job comparison. I think Mr. Bennett did a good job of research. The numbers aren't printed in his paper. The TC Palm people only talked about 2 individuals. They should look at everyone else and see what percentage of people that are, what females and males are paid in other areas of his organization.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. John Shaman will ask the next question of Mr. Domino.
Well, gentlemen, all aboard Florida has been dominating a lot of the news, especially north of the Palm Beach County line. It appears that at this point, this train's going to run right through District 18 without stopping. You both say that you were against this train. So the question to you, Mr. Domino, is can this train be stopped?
Well, I believe this train can be stopped. I know I was at a presentation in April when the congressman said, well, Congress really doesn't vote on it. It's going to be hard to stop it. At that time, he had yet to put on paper his opposition. I think the first time, according to Not All Aboard Florida, they did that was in July. For many months, he was for All Aboard Florida. All Aboard Florida, the Achilles heel of All Aboard Florida is simply the monies they need to build. It's a $2.6 billion project. Initially, they were going to $1.6 billion loan from the government, which I thought made no sense. And now they're talking about getting some public activity bonds. I think if they go out to the market, they will find, as they did some months ago, they need to pay 12% interest on those bonds. If you borrow $1.5 billion at 12%, your annual interest rate is $180 million. By the time you amortize the cost and pay your thing, it's $250 million in expenses. They're talking about 1 million riders at say 50 or 75, that's 50 to 75,000. Without freight, without the real estate development, it would become clear to everyone that it's economically unviable. And that's the message that needs to be stopped. I will say this, if All Aboard Florida does go through, it will be in part because of Congressman Murphy's letters after letter to the DOT and speeches saying, this is the future of public transportation in America. This project should be expedited. If I lead Congress, you can be sure that we will allow voice to stop that train in its tracks.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. Mr. Murphy, your response.
Let's just be clear, there's only one person on this stage that has voted for taxpayer subsidized rail, and that's Mr. Domino with Sunderland. I am 100% opposed to All Aboard Florida. And as I said in my opening statement, I'm actually very serious concerns about what it's going to do to our community. And in light of the actual question you asked, John, I have demanded and urged the Coast Guard to come to our area to do real hearings, to actually listen to the people, to hear what the very specific concerns are, whether that's commercial use of the maritime industry, whether that's recreational use. I have had numerous conversations with Secretary Fox explaining exactly why I'm against this project, and I worked across the aisle with Congressman Bill Posey, just north of us, a Republican, asking the GAO to do an independent feasibility study of this project, because I don't think this will pass the test when it comes to financial analysis.
May I respond for 30 seconds? As to the
3-second
Sunrail,
rebuttal.
as to the Sunrail vote, and I know Mr. Murphy hasn't visited all of the state, that's an infrastructure project in Orlando, Florida, similar to the subway system in New York. I and the rest of the legislature voted for it. It is now up and running. It has nothing to do with a private company getting 1.5 million of our money and running through our commercial and entertainment area.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. Next question will be asked by Isadora Rangel of Mr. Murphy.
Congressman, you're running one of the best funded campaigns in the country for Congress, and most of the money comes from special interest groups, PACs, and from big companies. How do these campaign donations affect the work you do in this district?
First of all, let me say I'm humbled and thankful for the support that I receive, and in large part that's because of my independent voting record, because people know what I stand for. And just to be clear, it's not the majority of the money that I've raised. We'd be more than happy to show you all the numbers, but the truth is, I've been one of the strongest advocates of campaign finance reform. I believe we need to make some very, very serious changes to exactly how folks get elected to Congress. And I'm on, I think, basically every piece of legislation to do just that. And I'm actually writing my own legislation, a constitutional amendment, that would actually limit the amount of time that folks can raise money, because it is completely out of control. However, you have to play by the rules in place. I give one pledge to folks that support my campaign, and that is that I'm going to be the hardest working congressperson that represents the interest of this district number 1, and that's it.
Thank you. Mr. Domino?
Well, 2 years ago, he was campaigning in ads saying "fooey" on special interest money. Special interest money corrupts people. I don't necessarily believe that. I believe campaigns are expensive, and there are people that will help you. Generally, the people that help you are the people that believe in what you believe in. For example, J Street is one of his major supporters. Big Labor, one of his major supporters. And God bless the Murphy family, one of his biggest supporters, because they in America started companies, made money, they have every right to spend it on their son. I believe this: you can't be a hypocrite. And to say you have to take advantage of everything, I don't raise my kids to do that. You figure out what's right and what's wrong, and you try to do what's right. There will always be money in campaign because we've got to pay for ads, but when you're overwhelmingly raising money from special interests, there's a quid pro quo.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Domino. We'll now move on to candidate questions. The first question is from Mr. Domino to Mr. Murphy. When you returned from Afghanistan this past May, you stated you were happy to see the Taliban being held at bay. Every day we are seeing massacres of Afghan citizens by the Taliban. Where is the stability in the Middle East you say existed?
I don't remember that exact quote, but let me just remind everyone of that trip. I had an opportunity to go to Afghanistan for Memorial Day, and I actually went with Michelle Bachmann, of all people. It was one of the last Codels ever to go to Afghanistan because of the troop withdrawal. So it was a great opportunity for me to meet our Americans that are on the front lines, protecting our country, protecting our freedoms. And I believe, and what I said was that Afghanistan, I believe, has a fighting chance because of the brave men that have been, and women that have been over there fighting. I believe there's a few key elements that are necessary for Afghanistan to work. They need a political system that functions. In their last election, they had about 60% turnout, 40% of which were women in the urban areas. This is huge. 12 years ago in Afghanistan, women couldn't be seen in the streets alone. Number 2 is some sort of security. Afghanistan has 350,000 troops, many of which were trained by the United States of America. Now, a lot of these troops are doing it for the money, but a lot of these folks are real fighters. They believe in their country. They want to fight for their country. And if you have those first 2 elements, then you get the third key element, and that is the economy. And the only way that that works, of course, is with the former 2. You need some sort of security, you need a police force, you need a political system that works. And if you have that, then you can have the economy. It turns out in Afghanistan, they have trillions of dollars of natural resources that can be extracted. While it's a rudimentary economy, there is a chance if all 3 things work in coordination, Afghanistan, I believe, has a fighting chance.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. The next question is from Mr. Murphy to Mr. Domino. You released a fixed Congress first proposal this spring, yet voted for 3 pay raises during your time in the legislature, as well as charged taxpayers for a trip from Paris. Why?
Well, it's typical of the lack of homework that Mr. Murphy has done. I did vote for some pay raises of modest amounts and also some pay cuts. But let me tell you what those numbers are. Legislators get paid about $28,000. He gets paid $174,000. While I can afford to serve with absolutely no compensation, many of the people can't. And I think to give your state legislature $28,000 to $29,000. As for the free trip to Paris, I wish my wife could answer that question. I paid for 4 tickets for my wife and my family to go to both Paris and London. We went to Paris, they went to London. I flew back for a special session and charged the legislature for my trip to Tallahassee. There was no government paying for any trip to Paris. If they had offered, I probably would have turned it down. But certainly they didn't pay for my wife and kids. And you can just ask Sharon who paid for those tickets because she watches the bills pretty closely.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. Round 2 of our questions. The first question of this round will be from Mr. Bennett to Mr. Murphy.
Congressman, on your first day in office, one of the very first votes that you cast in Congress was for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker of the House. Can you explain why you believe that Nancy Pelosi represents the values and interests of Congressional District 18 more than John Boehner or any other candidate?
You know, when you look back at all of my votes, I have actually voted against Nancy Pelosi 47% of the time. So she's probably asking herself that same question, George. You know, when you look at all the votes, I in fact vote with Congressman Tom Rooney and Bill Posey, 2 Republicans, more often than I do Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership. So I have proven myself to be an independent voice, to be a voice of you know, someone that represents this district well. And you know, truthfully, I think a lot of people in this room would agree that leadership on both sides of the aisle has a lot to blame. And if you want to talk just real quick about partisanship, when you look at that same analysis of T votes and the breakdown I just gave of my record, when Mr. Domino was in the state legislature, he voted 89% of the time with his party. So when it comes to partisanship and who's going to go to D.C. and be lockstep with their party, there's 2 very clear differences here. If you want someone that's a partisan, vote for my opponent. If you want someone that's going to be an independent voice and has proven himself to be so, vote for me.
Thank you, Mr. Domino.
Well, there's one thing that Mr. Murphy and I agree on, that you have to work across the aisle. And that's why I'm pleased to tell you of Marie Sachs, who's the leading senator in the state Democratic Party, who recently, well, not recently, a few years ago, said I was the least partisan representative of the state house. He votes 84% of the time with his party. They're running ads against me, not by him, because he's got plenty of money, but the Democratic Party. I'm always amused by Nancy Pelosi's lack of understanding of reality. I followed the energy companies for years, and all of a sudden, because of technology, I'm getting more and more energy. And she proudly said, we're going to let natural gas take the place of fossil fuel in America. My friends, natural gas is a fossil fuel, and we don't need Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker of the House. She said her return to Speaker comes through Florida, and it comes through Congressman Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. The next question will be asked of Janet Eschbach to Mr. Domino.
Mr. Domino, in 1996, Congress actually passed the Defense of Marriage Act. This year, the Supreme Court said that they would not be hearing cases of appeal that gay marriage should be, excuse me, the DOMA is unconstitutional. Where do you stand on gay marriage, and do you believe it should be for both men and women and men and men?
Well, I'm going to give you 2 quick answers to that. I am a traditionalist who believe that marriage is an institution for men and women. But having just completed 3 years of law school at Nova Southeast University, I give great sanctity to what the Supreme Court rules. I would take the oath of office. There's a lot of things going on that I don't necessarily agree with. But when I was 23, I took the oath of office as a military officer. I've taken it as a legislator. So whatever the Supreme Court comes up with, that's going to be the law of the land as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. Mr. Murphy.
Yes, I support marriage equality, and I believe that families deserve equal protection under the law. It's as simple as that.
Okay, the next question will be asked by John Shainman of Mr. Murphy.
Congressman, you mentioned in your opening statements that you procured $12 million in federal money for beachwood nourishment, $38 million for the C-44 canal. What we've seen over the years is that while the federal and state governments say that they're going to split 50-50 on a lot of these water projects, it never seems to be that way. I mean, the money you just mentioned pales in comparison to what Senator Negron here managed to get for the Indian River Lagoon this year. How can the federal government do more, and you specifically, in getting more money to clean the Indian River Lagoon?
Thank you, John. First, that $12 million was already spent on beach renourishment and inlet dredging, and I'm a strong advocate for beach renourishment in particular because for every dollar spent on renourishing our beaches, it comes back 11 to 1 to our economy. Regarding the $38 million, that is in the president's budget, and one thing I didn't mention in the opening, I think is worth noting, was for the first time in 7 years, this Congress passed a water bill, and in it included 4 key projects amounting to almost $1 billion. These are projects that are going to help clean and treat that dirty water, send it south. We got an additional $400 million of credits approved to go to the South Florida Water Management District for work that they've actually already done. So we've had a lot of money actually already authorized to go to investing right here and to go to South Florida Water Management District. And there was a key amendment in there that I was very much a part of. That helped clean up the bureaucracy and the red tape between the South Florida Water Management District and the Army Corps of Engineers. But most importantly, what it did was allow the South Florida Water Management District to move forward with any project approved by the Army Corps of Engineers. That is critical for those that follow the bureaucracy and red tape between these two agencies, because the truth is, South Florida Water Management District is more efficient when they do the work. Most of their projects come in under, about 30% less expensive than the Corps. So I believe getting rid of that red tape and pushing more to the state level, the feds have an obligation of that 50-50 split.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Domino?
Well, I certainly agree and applaud Congressman Murphy's interest in the lagoon. When I was elected to the legislature, I, with the Palm Beach County delegation, the rest of the legislature, one of those 80% votes was to get money for the fixing up of the Lox Hatchie River, the Lake Worth Lagoon, and to provide dock stamp money for beach renourishment throughout. We've fought, people come to this state. I hope all that money that the congressman's talked about actually gets here. I understand the Senate is not taking up some of the bills, but it's very important that we protect our environment. People move down here, they want for their children and their grandchildren clean beaches, clean water, and clean skies. I think a Republican legislator in Congress will have a better opportunity of getting our share. Of the $7 billion CERT program, the state has put in their 3.5, the feds have not put theirs in.
Thank you. Our next question will be asked by Isadora Rango of Mr. Domino.
Mr. Domino, a lot of local governments want to get residents off septic tanks. Is there something that Congress can do to help pay for this very costly project?
Well, so the thing behind that is, although we've heard for years in the lagoons and the estuaries that there's been waters that come from Lake Okeechobee with their nutrients causing some of the problems, the scientists at Harbor Branch at FAU are finding out that fecal matter is an issue. So there may well be a federal role in finding the funding. I can't say that I know every nuance of how the federal system works, but if there's appropriate federal money, that's something we should fight for. And of course, if it should be done in the state, we should work with our state legislators to make sure that we can achieve that.
Yes, there is definitely a role that the federal government can play in this, and our Indian River Lagoon is the most biologically diverse estuary in the entire country. It's important that it's protected. And when you look at this year, for example, it hasn't been as rainy, believe it or not, despite coming in today, as last year. And we haven't had a single discharge out of Lake Okeechobee on the East Coast. There's been some on the west and the Hatchie, but a lot of the runoff that we're seeing is urban runoff. This actually poses a really big problem up and down the coast, and I have supported and advocated trying to help our local communities get those grants so we can help people move from septic over to sewer. So that is a work in process, and I'm going to continue advocating for those projects.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. We'll actually proceed with the next round of questions from our panelists. We'll begin with Mr. Bennett. Question for Mr. Domino.
You criticized Congressman Murphy for his stance on immigration, and you called it amnesty. One of the supporters of the Senate immigration reform bill that Congressman Murphy supports is Marco Rubio, who has recently did a robocall for you. Do you consider Senator Rubio a supporter of amnesty? And what should be done, if not using the Senate's approach, which is stalled in the House, what should be done about immigration?
Well, as you know, the Senator has backed away from his advocacy of a full and comprehensive plan. And part of that is because the President has refused to enforce the laws that are on the books now. We've got 70,000 kids coming across the border, and they should be adjudicated within 90 days, but now it's 2 and 3 years. The three things we can do first. One is we need to support border control as best as we can. Someone will get through, but we need to make a better effort. And the Republican bill had hundreds of millions of dollars to do that, and the Congress decided to vote against that. The second thing we need to do is enforce our laws. We don't need a 3 and 4 year. The Constitution mandates that once an illegal gets here, they get both a notice of hearing and a hearing. That should not be a 3 or 4 year process. It needs to be expedited, and that's why that bill had money to expedite that process. And finally, half the illegals come legally and then stay. We need to hold the employers accountable for making sure illegals go back. Let me make it clear, everyone in this room comes from immigrants. Immigration has been one of the great things, the melting pot of America. But all of our grandparents played by the rules. And all we're asking is that people play by the rules. The state of Florida has to spend over $1 billion a year of their precious revenues on people that legally should not be here.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy.
Yes, I support comprehensive immigration reform, something that, as George, you alluded to, was supported by Marco Rubio, by Jeb Bush. There is a no-brainer of a bill that passed the Senate with 67 votes, largely bipartisan. Number one, it secures our border, and it does a better job of tracking those folks that come into our country. Number two, it ensures that students that go to our universities, the MITs and Harvard especially, get a visa right after they graduate. Why should they go to other countries and start competing against us? But the key and, of course, toughest part of this is that pathway to citizenship. I believe these folks, like what's outlined in the Senate plan, should get to the back of the line, should learn English, should pay their back taxes, and over that period of time of 12 years, they're on their way to becoming citizenship. And by the way, if you were to pass that, CBO came out recently and said it would reduce our long-term debt by over $900 billion.
Thank you. The next question will be asked by Janet Eschbach of Mr. Murphy.
Representative Murphy, we've seen in recent weeks the panic of Ebola, in recent years, the reality of dengue fever, and serious viruses like enterovirus killing children. When we talk about combating what is essentially infectious disease warfare in this country, how do we do it effectively? Because everyone says we're ready, and we simply have proven that we're not.
It's a great question. I think everyone in this room is probably concerned, as am I, about Ebola, not only in Africa, but in our own country, and its potential of spreading throughout the world. CDC came out and said by January they expect over 1.3 million cases. I have called on the administration to put a ban on the flights coming into our country, with exceptions, of course, for aid workers and doctors that want to go overseas and help. And I'm happy to see today the administration has actually made that first step to doing that. I believe and ask the administration to put a point person in charge of handling this entire Ebola situation. And again, happy that they've made that first step. I believe we need increased screenings at all of our airports. The estimate is that 93% of the folks coming in from Western Africa are coming into 5 airports. Let's increase the screening in those airports. I also think we need a full investigation into exactly what happened in Dallas, because as you stated, Janet, we were not prepared. I do not think this country was prepared for this, and we need to get exactly to the bottom of what happened in Dallas, how the protocol failed, how CDC was slow to react, and make sure that our nurses and those folks that are on the front line dealing with this have all the equipment and have the resources necessary to protect themselves, but save lives. So I believe we need a full investigation into exactly what happened.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Domino.
Well, I'm quite happy that the Congressman agrees that the administration is asleep at the switch on this important issue. I had called for either entry restrictions or quarantine those people who come from Western Africa. I think that is certainly an intrusion on their right of movement, but it's necessary to protect the American people. I believe, like the Congressman, we need a person who oversees the effort in a united way. But I do not believe that person should be a political operative. It should be a doctor, someone that understands the nuances. And finally, I am deeply disturbed that we're sending 3,000 American troops into Western Africa, and we're not providing hazmat gear. I think that's dangerous. I think that's unfair to our troops. They should be protected fully from the possibility of contracting Ebola.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. The next question we ask by John Shaman of Mr. Domino.
Mr. Domino, by 2033, there's a lot of talk that Social Security may no longer be solvent. Do you favor some form of privatization when it comes to Social Security? How would you make Social Security solvent?
I think Social Security is a compact between the American people. The theory is you pay into it, it's on an insurance program, it's a forced savings, and it's serving many of our citizens well. But the numbers are the numbers. We've used the money in the so-called Social Security Trust Fund for other government needs, and therefore there is a future risk. I do not agree with privatization. And in fact, I think what an intelligent person would do would look at the whole array of possible solutions and take the ones that in combination make the most sense. The earlier you do it, of course, the better off you are. The only one I would specifically say, I believe that money that's collected from you and I out of our paychecks ought to really be put in a trust fund instead of just buying government IOUs. And I think professional money managers should try to get the historic returns of 8 to 10% that all of our states and most of our large corporations do, which is an advantage. Right now, the idea of the trust fund is a fiction. They owe themselves the billions of dollars. The same comments adhere to Medicare. The earlier you do it, the less dramatic the changes have to be. And I would like to be involved in putting together the mix of things that would ensure that our citizens, as they reach retirement age, and as you know, there's a big bubble, can count on Social Security.
Thank you, Mr. Domino.
I believe Social Security is one of the most important programs in our country's history. It has lifted and kept more people out of poverty than nearly any other program. And the truth is, when you look at the numbers, it is 100% sustainable until the year 2033. Right now, the way Social Security works, of course, is you pay into a cap, and that cap right now is $117,000. That cap moves every year. The quicker you are to raise that cap to say $150,000, the quicker we are to have this conversation, the more solvent Social Security is going to be. And when you look at the numbers, it's sort of like a bell curve. There's a group of baby boomers entering the system that must be accounted for. My opponent says now that he doesn't support privatizing it, but we actually have him on film saying he supports privatizing it and sending that money to Wall Street. We all know what happens in Wall Street, and there's a great chance that will collapse and those savings will be eviscerated.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. The next question we ask from Isadora Rangel for Mr. Murphy.
Congressman, this year you voted for the Farm Bill, which, among other things, gives price supports to sugar growers whose farms stay in a way of a natural water flow between Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades. Would you vote for the Farm Bill again, and why?
Thank you for the question. I've been very vocal that I think there needs to be some very serious changes to the Farm Bill entirely. All of the subsidies, all of the help to all different industries, whether that's corn, whether that's wheat, or whether that's sugar. I think we need a complete review of that. And I actually signed a letter with several others in this delegation here in Florida saying that if other countries are willing to take away their subsidy of helping their own sugar growers, that I would be the first to take away that subsidy for our sugar growers. So we need a complete reform of the Farm Bill. And I'm a very strong advocate of that because that is one of the biggest, programs in our country where it needs to be revisited, where there are a lot of efficiencies that I believe can be had if we had a real debate. I'm, I guess, the only one again here on the stage that hasn't taken a dollar from the sugar industry. My opponent has taken thousands from them. And I don't necessarily point the finger just at sugar. There's a lot of industries and there's a lot of businesses that have changed over the years. 30, 40 years ago, a lot of folks polluted. A lot of folks were irresponsible, and we've learned a lot along the way, and we've come a long way. Doesn't mean they don't have more to do, but I believe in protecting American jobs over foreign jobs. So I think we need a forward view of the Farm Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Domino.
Yes, I was a little amused by someone who's taking money from every Wall Street firm that exists, berating Wall Street. In fact, Mr. Murphy, professional investment managers have returned 8 to 10% over long terms. You should be worried about Social Security. You're the one that's going to be affected. You're younger than I am. The farm community has been vital to our economy. The sugar people are very vital. Thousands of jobs in the Blaze. I basically don't believe in free markets. I believe we should understand there's some unique natures to farming. The farmers have to get loans from the banks. There's some price crop protections that might be appropriate. But by and large, we should produce those crops where we can produce them on a rural, competitive scale.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. Now we have our second and final round of candidate-to-candidate questions. This question is from Patrick Murphy to Mr. Domino. You have been attacking my record as too liberal, yet the U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed me, one of only 6 Democrats. Despite the fact that they have endorsed many challengers this year, why do you think they didn't endorse you?
I would point out that those that know business best in the state of Florida, Associated Industries of Florida has endorsed me. I would also point out that while I was in the legislature, I generally got their endorsement. Mr. Murphy has an advantage of incumbency. He's in Washington, D.C. He's working. And as he said, he's been one of the people on the Democratic side that has had more pro-business as he's protected his Wall Street friends than others. But the fact is, on the key votes, the votes to have amnesty, which of course the Chamber supports, the votes to keep Obamacare, and other votes that are important to the members of this district, he has not voted. So the answer to that is the people that know me the best have endorsed me.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. The next question is from Carl Domino to Patrick Murphy. You recently left the Republican Party and could have registered as an independent, but you chose to register as a Democrat. Why?
I was raised in a household that was always about the individual, always the candidate. My dad's a registered Republican, my mom's an independent. And I grew up always knowing that you have to support the person, not a party. Fast forward a little bit, after I registered as a Republican, my dad's my best friend and my mentor. So I said, hey, I guess I'm a Republican too. And as I started paying attention more and more, 18, 19, 20 years old, and started paying attention to the Iraq War, I thought we were being lied to as a country. I thought that was one of the biggest mistakes our country's ever made, and I began getting pretty frustrated with what I was seeing. And then fast forward a little bit more to the Tea Party, and this is a movement that started off talking about fiscal responsibility, which I support. I'm a CPA, we definitely need that. But it went off, in my opinion, on more of a tangent. And I said, you know what? When you look at every single issue being discussed today or outside of this room, whether that's immigration, whether that's healthcare, unemployment, debt, you name it, these are all issues that, truthfully, as my opponent said, are going to affect my generation more than my parents and grandparents. I better get involved. I better do something about it. And I'm not going to sit back and point a finger and complain. And the truth is, I'm fiscally responsible and socially accepting. And I don't have to change my story as a Democrat. And when you look at my voting record, you look at my independence, I've shown myself, I believe, to do just that. And, let's not forget, my opponent used to be a Democrat too, so I guess there's 2 people that have changed parties on the stage.
Thank you. Please hold your laughter. Thank you. Let's move on to our final round of questions from the panel. Mr. Bennett, George Bennett, your question for Mr. Murphy.
Congressman, you're a supporter of raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office this year in February released a report that said that doing so could cost 500,000 jobs, possibly up to 1 million jobs. Is that an acceptable trade-off in this economy?
There's been a lot of studies actually going in both directions of that argument. I do support raising the minimum wage and was proud to vote for that. This was a bill that over the next several years would raise the minimum wage from, say, $7.93 in Florida to $10.10. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow progression. And then it indexes it to inflation. I think it's unacceptable to have a single mom working 40 hours a week, still living in poverty in this country. I believe, when you look at the numbers as well, and look at the 13 states that have actually gone ahead and raised that minimum wage, they actually have the lowest 13 unemployment rates in the country. So there is a direct correlation there, because let's not forget, folks on minimum wage, folks in that bracket spend basically 100% of their income into our economy. That's the multiplier effect. Folks that are making much more, of course, save that money and it sits in the bank account. So I believe that we need to encourage more states to raise that minimum wage, because if you look at the numbers, it actually reduces unemployment.
Thank you. Mr. Domino?
Well, thank you. I'm glad the Congressman reminded me that I changed from Democrat to Republican. The Republican president at that time was Ronald Reagan. He changed from Republican to Democrat because he wanted to support Barack Obama. He said something in his answer that intrigues me. First of all, the reality is it would cost jobs. But what he said was that the lady working hard, 40-hour-a-week job would make less money. The reality is the 40-hour-a-week jobs are disappearing. Talk to people that hire people at the lower level. They're getting 28-hour jobs because of the Obamacare program, which she so much advocates. In a time when the combined unemployment rate discouraged and actual is over 12%, and the participation rate is back to the Jimmy Carter years, we should let states choose to, if they choose, raise the minimum wage. That should not be a federal issue.
Thank you, Mr. Domino. The next question will be asked by Janet Eschbach of Mr. Domino.
We've been fighting the war on drugs for several decades now, with no end in sight. We lead the entire world in people in prison. Where do you stand on the decriminalization of marijuana, the legalization of medical marijuana, and the future of the war on drugs?
Well, there is on this Florida ballot amendment too, which would legalize so-called medical marijuana. And there are different kinds of drugs. Every day we read about some Hollywood star literally ending his life at 25 or 35 because of other things like heroin and cocaine. Unlike another famous politician, I actually never took any drugs of those sort in my life. Never did I have. Here's my answer on the medical marijuana amendment that's up now. We should allow people to take any drug that would have a beneficial medical effect. So if you have a glaucoma or things that medical marijuana would help, then that should be allowed. But like every other drug, it should go through the FDA approval process, because the FDA looks at every drug that's being used for a medical reason and says it's safe, it won't cause other side effects, and it's efficient in terms of doing what it's supposed to be. So my answer to your question is, if medical marijuana, so-called medical marijuana is allowed, then it should be subject to FDA approval. And I would remind you, our federal statute still says it's illegal, so I would just say this: we should do what we can to help people, but there is a process to approve drugs in America. The FDA has done a good job, and we should stick to that process.
Very quickly, Mr. Domino, you didn't address the war on drugs. Where do you see that going?
30 seconds.
Well, the war on drugs has caused a lot of difficulties, and once again, I have children, and I would tell you this: if some kid at the local school 100 yards down is selling them cocaine or heroin, there ought to be a war on those people, and they ought to be put incarcerated. I don't want my kids' life to be ruined by a drug dealer when they're 14 or 15.
Mr. Murphy?
I believe that medical marijuana is a state issue. We all have an opportunity to vote for that on this election's ballot. It's Amendment 2, and I support medical marijuana. I believe it needs strict restrictions and guidelines around that. But to your question specifically, we have a major problem with other more powerful drugs, such as Oxycontin, in our communities. I read a stat that said in the state of Florida, we have more Oxycontin here than every other state combined times 10. That is ridiculous. We've got to do something with these pill mills. We've got to do something with the amount of prescription drugs being abused out there. I believe we need to invest more into the folks that are going to go out and crack down on these abusers. I believe this also, brings back the immigration question on the fact that we need to strengthen our borders. I also want to point out that in this congressional district, since the day I've been elected, there's been over 160 shootings, much of which were in Fort Pierce, a town riddled with violence, much of which is because of the gangs and the drug-related violence. We've got to do more to stop this.
Thank you. Next question will be asked by John Shaman to Mr. Murphy.
Congressman, like Social Security, Medicaid, looks like we have an expiration date on that, not too far off in the distance. You voted against the Ryan budget, which would have created some sort of premium supports. How do we fix Medicare, Medicaid, so that it's there for all of us down the road?
Again, Medicare and Social Security are two of the most important programs in our country's history, and we have got to ensure that Medicare is going to be there for future generations. Start off with going after Medicare fraud. South Florida leads the country in the amount of Medicare fraud. For every dollar invested after going after this, they find $11 in fraud. That to me is a no-brainer, that we should be investing more money to go after that Medicare fraud. It's right here in our backyard. Another issue I think that's very important, and what I would say a no-brainer, is allowing our government to start negotiating with the pharmaceutical companies. Right now, the VA does that to much success to bring down those medical costs, drug costs for our veterans. The federal government should be doing the same thing with Medicare recipients. And the most important piece is bending that long-term cost curve. The rate at which Medicare has been growing until the last couple of years is completely unsustainable. If you look at the last 2 years, it's somewhere between 2 to 4%. If we are going to get our long-term debt under control, it's got to start with Medicare. To put it into context, if we can keep our Medicare costs rising and our healthcare costs are rising in this country around 3.8, 3.9%, which is what they have in the last 2 years, you can get rid of almost 50% of that long-term debt of $17.5 trillion. That's how big a piece of pie Medicare costs are, medical costs are in our country. So we've got to build and bend that cost curve.
Thank you. Mr. Domino.
Well, thank you, and I know you slipped a little bit in asking the question. I'm not saying this to embarrass you, but you did talk about Medicaid and Medicare. Medicaid is a state program, Medicare is a federal program. But the reason I bring that up is this. The Democrats, by and large, want to solve Medicare by telling doctors and patients what their agenda should be. In the state, in Medicaid, we do much the same thing to fund it. But then we tell doctors what their reimbursement rates are going to be. And for many specialties, frankly, there are almost no doctors that will provide Medicaid services. So Medicare, just like Social Security, we need a way, once again, to understand the dynamics of funding it. And importantly, the earlier you step up to the plate, there have been groups, the Road Commission, others that have come up with solutions and everyone has walked away from it. These are obviously not easy things to do, but the earlier you do them, then we can ensure that when Patrick Murphy in 30 years is ready for Medicare, it's available for him.
The next question will be asked, the final question actually, by Isidore Rangel to Mr. Domino.
Mr. Domino, when you were in the state legislature in 2010, you voted for a bill that would have required women seeking a first trimester abortion to undergo an ultrasound. That bill was vetoed by Governor Crist. Why did you vote for that bill?
As with most bills, there were many, many things in that bill, as you well know. The Constitution, the judgments rendering the Constitution make it very clear that under certain circumstances, you cannot place an undue burden on a lady's right to get an abortion. That would be in the first trimester. That would be when rape, incest, or her livelihood is involved. Courts have subsequently ruled that having her look at a ultrasound, and that was not my favorite thing because, as you know, I also at sometimes vote against it. You've got a big bill and you've got to take your vote. Has turned out not to be an undue burden, and therefore does not inhibit the right that every lady has in America to have an abortion in accordance with the rulings handed down by the Supreme Court.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Yes, I'm 100% pro-choice and support a woman's right to choose. My opponent, I don't know, he's had kind of been on both sides of this issue. There was a event recently where he said he doesn't know if he's pro-choice or pro-life, but what we do know is what you just referred to, and that was a piece of legislation in the state legislature where Mr. Domino would demand that women could have an ultrasound. Then just this year filled out a survey saying that he would support a constitutional amendment to overturn Roe v. Wade. That to me is unacceptable.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. We'll move on to the closing statements. Believe it or not, we're running ahead of time, unless you'd like a lightning round. Okay, I won't throw that.
Yes,
all right. Okay, moving on to our closing statements, 90 seconds. We begin with Mr. Murphy.
Well, again, Beth, thank you so much for your leadership in putting this together. I know it's a lot of work. For the panel, for the great questions, the audience, no screaming or yelling, that's nice. You know, I always think back to a great quote from President Truman. He said, "It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit." You know, so much of Washington, D.C. is people pointing a finger, trying to blame others, trying to take credit for something that's not theirs. We're trying to jockey for power for that next election. We've got to get back to the business of doing what's best for Americans. Forget the Republicans, forget the Democrats. It's about America. And that's what matters right now. I'm proud of the positive campaign that I've run. And I'm proud of the independent voting record that I've established. And, you know, the truth is, you don't have to take my word for it. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed me, one of 6 Democrats in the whole country. The Audubon recently labeled me a champion of the Everglades. The T.C. Palm and Palm Beach Post both endorsed my candidacy, saying I'm a, quote, moderate ideal for the district. You see, no matter what the vote is, no matter what we're looking at, I don't do what any party leadership says. I look at every issue and I say, how is that going to affect the Palm Beach and Treasure Coast? How is that going to affect the state of Florida? How does it affect our country? And then, how does it sit beside? So no matter what the issue is, I will always be that independent voice for you in Washington, D.C., and always put problem solving above partisanship. I hope to have your vote, and thank you very much for being here this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. You can applause on the closing statements.
Well, I want to express my appreciation to the Chamber for having this. This is the ninth forum I've done during this season. It's the first one, no, the second one, excuse me, that the Congress has decided to show up at. Last week, Barack Obama said it best. He said, "My name's not on the ballot, but my policies are." Mr. Murphy apparently has forgotten just 2 years ago, he ran saying, doing the work of President Barack Obama in Congress. Mr. Murphy did get the endorsement of the Palm Beach Post, but in this day and age, can you believe what they said? He says his positions were a result of a political calculus. Yes, Patrick Murphy's a very smart person with a lot of money, and he understands that 2 years ago it was popular in a presidential year to be a Democrat, but now it's popular to be an independent. But he had a choice to become an independent, and he refused to exercise that choice. People ask me at my age, why am I running? It's very simple. Through my life, I believed in public service. I spent 20 years in the military. I fought in Vietnam. I started business in the community and created jobs. I fought for the lagoons, and I fought for scripts, and I fought for tax cuts when I was in the legislature. But the reason I'm running is because Sharon and I have 14-year-old twins. And I want those twins to have the same opportunities to capture the American dream that I had. Poll after poll shows that the average person does not believe their children have the same opportunities that they had, and we need to change that direction. Thank you very much.
Mr. Patrick Murphy, as well as Mr. Carl Domino, thank you so much for taking the time in your busy campaign schedules to be here. That concludes our debate for Congressional District 18, produced by the Northern Palm Beach County Chamber of Commerce, here at the EC Campus Theater at Palm Beach State College. We also want to thank our media panel, our host, Palm Beach State College, and our presenting sponsor, the Hanley Center Foundation. Everybody, we hope this has been helpful to you as you head to the polls. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.